Hey guys, if you found this, uh, sorry about that. I don't know exactly what happened. I was trying to share my stupid PowerPoint and it did not work. So I guess I'm going to give you guys a couple more minutes to get started. Let me see what else I can do. And it doesn't. Hey, yes, I think we're back. So I think maybe the PowerPoint idea was a good idea, but I'm not sure exactly how I broke my live stream, but it would not put my camera back on for some reason. And I could still see I was live. Nothing would, I don't know. As I've said a couple times, I haven't done many of these. So, yeah. So I guess hopefully people will join back and we can get started again. I do have a PowerPoint that I wish I could share. I think the problem is with turning the pages. There we go. So as long as this still works, I think we can do it. I just can't see what I'm doing. And there's other ways to do this. Uh, I'm aware of those ways. I just can't do it. I don't have enough bandwidth to do it. Um, is kind of the thing. But yeah, I think I know what happened. I clicked on the wrong screen. I was looking at what you guys were seeing and not my actual PowerPoint. Um, but all right, so let's try this again. I'm just gonna start over in case anybody missed anything. Now you get to um, hear the whole thing. Welcome to Timeless Mysteries Live Edition. Tonight, we're dissecting a crime that shocked the entire nation. In August of 2018, Chris Watts murdered his entire family. He eventually confessed to the crime, sparing us a drawn out trial. However, we're here to explore the grim question: could Chris Watts have gotten away with murder had he not confessed? It's a haunting scenario, one that forces us to examine modern forensics, psychological profiles, and the intricacies of courtroom tactics. By the end, you'll see that the truth is rarely simple and that the burden of proof can shift in surprising ways when the case goes to trial without a direct admission of guilt. Hey, Lauren, yeah, you made it on time. I messed up, but um, so now if I can click the right PowerPoint, we can go to the next one. Um, one of these days I'll figure it out actually how to do this, but it's gonna take me some time. I've just got too many things on my screen. Chris Watts lived in Frederick, Colorado with his wife Shanann and their two daughters, Bella and Celeste. Shanann was also pregnant with a baby boy they planned to name Nico. From the outside, the Watts family embodied your typical suburban life: a comfortable home, a seemingly loving marriage, and two healthy children. Shanann's social media presence contributed to this image of domestic contentment. Yet behind those closed doors, there were cracks. Financial pressure mounted. The Wattses had declared bankruptcy in 2015. Shanann's pregnancy meant additional expenses, and Chris was involved in an affair with a coworker. Tension brewed inside that home, even though neighbors rarely saw anything amiss. On August 13th of 2018, Shanann's friend Nicole Atkinson's alerted police when Shanann missed a doctor's appointment and stopped answering her phone. Officers arrived to find Shanann's car, her purse, and her cell phone and medication still at the house, but there was no sign of Shanann or the children. Chris's demeanor was described as oddly calm. His neighbor's surveillance video showed Chris backing up his truck into his driveway very early that morning, which was an unusual behavior that Chris had a hard time explaining. In real life, Chris Watts cracked under pressure, failing the polygraph test and eventually confessing. But tonight, we're removing that confession from the equation. If Chris Watts had remained silent, never offering investigators the truth, would the evidence alone have been enough to secure his conviction? Hey, riding down the rabbit hole, how are you today? So I've got this PowerPoint, but I don't know how to use it properly. So next, we're going to kind of look at the key evidence. So we're going to begin by outlining the major pieces of evidence that the investigation yielded. Confession or no confession. There was the surveillance footage. A neighbor's camera recorded Chris backing his truck into the driveway around 5:27 on August 13th. Chris claimed he was simply leaving for work, but the footage was unusual enough that the neighbor, Nate, became suspicious. Shanann's personal items. Shanann's phone was found inside of the house, stuffed in the couch, her purse and medication, and all of the children's belongings were still present. Investigators noted that Shanann, who was very active on social media, would have never left her phone behind on purpose. There were text messages, the digital footprints showing Shanann texting her friends, talking about marital discord, and she confided in them that Chris had been pulling away. Chris's phone records hint at an affair with a coworker. Investigators found deleted messages and suspicious Google searches regarding life changes, relationship queries, and the possibility of covering up wrongdoing. There's also the GPS data. Yeah, I'm sorry about the chat bot. I don't know how to set those things up, but I did that to remind you guys to click the little heart button. And, you can also send stickers and whatnot if you want to. And where was I? So the chatbot's going to kind of just keep repeating. There's only like 4 messages that it does. If I had a real moderator, they could do this for me, and I wouldn't have to automate it. But and sorry, guys, I have way too many documents open on my screen. Let me just close some of them. Okay. So the GPS data, Chris's work truck had GPS tracking showing that he drove to a remote oil field early that morning. Later, Shanann's body was found in a shallow grave at the same site, and Bella and Celeste were discovered in the nearby oil tanks. Autopsy findings. Shanann had died by strangulation. Bella and Celeste were smothered. Forensic pathologists often classify these methods as intimate forms of homicide, implying a personal, close range killer. There's also the behavioral red flags. Chris's effect appeared flat. He conducted interviews pleading for his family to return. Oh, shoot. Pleading for his family to return. Um, and I will get better at this, I promise. I just need to figure out how not to lose my place. But my camera slipped off of the little thing I've got it setting on. Um, so yeah, he conducted porch interviews pleading for his family's return, but viewers picked up on his awkwardness and his lack of visible grief. While not definitive proof of guilt, such incongruity often raises law enforcement suspicions. In a scenario without a confession, law enforcement and prosecutors would need to stitch these elements together to create a compelling narrative of guilt, one that meets the high legal standard of beyond reasonable doubt. This standard is central to our entire discussion. Could a jury be convinced solely through the evidence that Chris Watts orchestrated the murders, or might he cast enough doubt to walk free? Yeah, if Nicole Atkinson hadn't um, called the police, it's possible. Psychologists and criminologists sometimes label men who kill their spouse and children as family annihilators. Research suggests common themes: deep seated resentment, financial or marital stress, a desire to start a new life free from perceived burdens. Chris Watts seemed to tick many of those boxes. He had financial troubles, a pregnant wife he might have viewed as further complicating his life, and an extramarital affair. Some family annihilators believe murdering their family is a twisted way to restore control or preserve a certain image. Yes, Shanann's body was found in the field. I'm not sure what the question is. Um, but Nicole Atkinson had called the police when Shanann had missed a doctor's appointment, and they were very close. They were always texting, so it was really concerning for her. And I believe that Shanann was going to be just discovering the actual sex of the baby. They believed it was a boy, but they were going to make sure. So it was really an important doctor's appointment. Um, so back to family annihilators. Um, some family annihilators believe murdering their family is a twisted way to restore control or preserve a certain image. Yet external appearances can deceive. Friends describe Chris as gentle, polite, and an attentive father. This discrepancy highlights the hallmark of domestic homicide. The killer can live behind a mask of normalcy, fooling everyone until a breaking point is reached. If Chris never confessed, the prosecution would likely call domestic violence and homicide experts to outline how tensions, especially the sexual affair with Nicole Kessinger and the economic stress, can erupt into familial violence. But understanding the psychology is only half the story. Courts require tangible evidence. Juries may be swayed by expert testimony about patterns of spousal violence or psychological profile of family annihilators, but if the state establishes a credible fact-based link between theory and the specifics of Chris's alleged actions, so while the family annihilator label might provide a clear motive or pattern, it wouldn't alone generate a conviction in a no confession scenario. That's where our next section focuses. We're going to look at trial mechanics and courtroom storytelling. The role of a confession in a homicide. Most of us know that a confession can be the crown jewel of a homicide investigation. It saves the prosecution from having to prove motive, opportunity, and the means um, in the most thorough way. In the real Chris Watts case, once he confessed, the prosecution secured a plea deal that that foreclosed the need for a jury trial, meaning all the evidence beyond his confession was never fully tested in court. Without a confession, prosecutors typically rely on circumstantial or forensic evidence. Contrary to popular belief, circumstantial evidence is not inherently weak. It can be incredibly convincing when multiple threads align, creating a tapestry that points to a suspect's guilt, but it requires more effort. Each piece must be authenticated, introduced properly, and explained persuasively to a jury that has been instructed not to convict unless they are convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. If Chris Watts refused to confess, the prosecution would have needed to methodically present every text message, every GPS record, and every forensic test result possible. Then they'd weave these elements into a logical, cohesive storyline. On the flip side, the defense would attempt to dismantle or exclude as much of that evidence as possible. The This tension between prosecution's story of guilt and the defense's cloud of doubt is essential to everything that happens in a trial. Um, it's 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 here at this point when courtroom strategy can determine the fate of the individual who is being charged. Um, and it's especially more challenging when you're missing the direct words, I did it. Let's now imagine a world where Chris Watts clings to innocence. He gives no confession, no plea deal. The district attorney charges him with first degree murder for each victim, along with unlawful termination of pregnancy. The stage is set for a high stakes trial, likely attracting intense media attention. Jury selection. With so much public scrutiny, many prospective jurors might already harbor opinions about Chris's guilt. Defense attorneys could request a change of venue, arguing the local community is biased. Prosecutors might push back, believing they can find 12 impartial individuals. Ultimately, a final panel is chosen, men and women who promise to put aside everything they've heard and base their decision solely on evidence presented uh, in court. The lie detector did say he lied, but if you look up how often lie detectors are actually admissible in court, it's a little less than 50-50. The judge might throw it out because lie detector tests are unreliable. And his defense attorney most likely could have got it thrown out because of the coercive nature, the way they presented the information to him to make him believe that it was 100% clear that he was guilty, even though it doesn't say anything other than he was possibly just really nervous. I think I've heard that if you squeeze your core, you can fool a lie detector test. I've never tested it out. I don't know. I've never been lie detected either. So, um, but yeah, that's a good question. So the opening statements, the prosecution is going to lay out its theory that Chris murdered his family to escape financial burdens and pursue a new life with his mistress. They hint at GPS data, text messages, and other damning evidence. The defense is going to they will declare there is no direct proof. They warn the jury about jumping to conclusions simply because the spouse is acting odd or because an affair exists. They'll emphasize the lack of eyewitnesses, pointing out the possibility that someone else could have harmed Shanann and the children. From that moment, each side battles to shape the narrative piece by piece, day by day. The prosecution has the heavier burden. They must prove each element of first degree murder. The defense only needs to stoke the flames of doubt, highlighting any gaps or inconsistencies. Now we arrive at the heart of our exploration. How is evidence handled, sorted, and argued in court when there is no direct confession? We'll answer that in our next section. Let me switch this. Oops, I almost broke the live stream again. Sorry, guys. You think he cheated on Nicole also? I don't. All right. So, real courtroom strategies, evidence gathering, and presentation. When prosecutors approach a case without a confession, it's all about storytelling backed by solid investigative work. Modern legal theory often emphasizes that juries remember narratives better than scattered facts. Thus, the state must organize every piece of evidence, be it digital, physical, or testimonial, into a cohesive tell of guilt. So let's break down how that might happen in a Chris Watts trial. The prosecutor's perspective, building a narrative, collecting and sorting evidence. After Chris's arrest, detectives would meticulously shift through phone logs, text messages, credit card receipts, bank statements, any electronic data from his truck. Investigators rank evidence by relevance. Directly, the first thing they're going to look for is anything that directly ties Chris to the crime, GPS coordinates at the disposal site. Then they're going to look for motive, the affair with Nicole Kessinger, financial stress. And then they're going to try to find a timeline that supports the facts. So they would look at neighbor surveillance footage and phone pings. And then, the last piece would be what corroborates pre and post crime behavior. So they would look at work records and other witness statements. Prosecutors then decide which items to prioritize in the courtroom. They want to avoid overwhelming the jury with, too many details because it can cause confusion. Too little detail fails to paint a full picture. So the persuasive storytelling, skilled trial lawyers understand that evidence alone isn't enough. They must guide the jury logically. Here's the day Shanann disappeared. Here's Chris's unusual early morning trip with his truck. Here's the digital trail proving where he went. Here's the motive. This is his affair. There's his financial reports. By tying each thread into a larger tapestry, the prosecution attempts to show that there is no plausible explanation besides Chris is guilty. The prosecution might introduce a text from Shanann's friend saying that where Shanann's friend replied to Shanann saying that she was afraid that Chris was pulling away, that he might be having an affair. And then they would follow it by who discovered Chris's truck GPS at the oil site. This back to back presentation links emotional distress, the motive, and suspicious behavior, the opportunity. Um, Keeping evidence admissible is also important. Prosecutors must ensure all evidence meets the legal standards for admissibility. It must be relevant, authentic, and more probative than prejudicial. For instance, if there were certain text messages that reveal personal but unrelated issues, like an unrelated fight between Shanann and a friend, the prosecutor might exclude them if they don't shed light on the murder. They want the cleanest, most direct path to proving Chris Watts was guilty. So, what is the opening statements? How important are they? I believe that they're probably the most important part of the trial, besides the evidence, because what you first hear is going to stick with you, I believe. So, um, this is how attorneys plan an opening statement. They choose a theme and theory for the case. They begin by identifying the theme. They want the jury to remember it. The murder, in a murder case like Chris Watts's, a central theme could be betrayal or the hidden tension behind the perfect family image. From there, they define a clear theory of the case, what exactly happened and why, based on evidence such as text messages, surveillance footage, and forensics data. An opening statement isn't just a list of facts, it's a carefully constructed story that jurors can follow easily. Prosecutors decide how to introduce each piece of evidence in chronological or even a thematic order. They plan to transition between topics so jurors can understand the link between, for example, financial stress and the ultimate murder. um, there's the emotional versus factual balance that they have to take into consideration, especially in family murders. There's a powerful emotional component. Prosecutors balance these emotions with factual detail, knowing the jury must see the case as supported by evidence, not driven by outrage alone. They highlight the evidence that will come in, like digital footprints, phone logs, and confessions or inconsistent statements. Even they're um, they also have to anticipate the defense's arguments. Um, so attorneys also anticipate likely defense theories. So they've got to also think like a defense attorney. So could it have been an accidental death, a missing timeline, or someone else did it kind of scenario? And subtly address them in their opening. They might say, you will hear suggestions that it could have been someone else to preemptively undermine those claims. The first impressions are lasting impressions. The jury the jury's initial perceptions form quickly. Studies show many jurors lash onto a basic storyline from the very start. Thus, attorneys devote substantial preparation time, sometimes weeks, to refining the opening's language, order of facts, and overall tone. So yesterday, I wrote my first ever attempt at writing an opening statement, and I'm particularly proud of this. I never, I mean, I've been following true crime and I've seen how they make statements and I've watched lots of crime shows. So I kind of have an idea what I think they might say. I am not an attorney, but if I was one, I think I could paint a pretty good story for the jury. So this is my example of what a prosecution's opening statement would be like. And I'll just let you know right now, it's not short. It's kind of about 5 to 10 minutes long, um, like a real opening argument would be. And I want you guys to listen for the parts that I kind of outlined um, just a few minutes ago on what they would be looking for um, when they do their opening statement. And let's see. So this is how I expect them to talk. So I'm trying to. It's kind of okay. May it please the court, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. On the morning of August 13th, 2018, a pregnant woman named Shanann Watts and her two young daughters, Bella and Celeste, seemingly vanished from their home in Frederick, Colorado. At first glance, it looked like a baffling disappearance. Shanann's car, still in the garage, the children's shoes and backpacks by the door. Her phone was left behind. Her husband, Chris Watts, stood before the news cameras that very day, pleading for their safe return. He told friends and neighbors and officers that he had no idea where they might be. He stood calmly on his own front porch, telling all of you, telling the world that he was worried sick. But as you will soon see, that facade of worry was just that, a facade. The evidence in this case will show that Chris Watts, the man who publicly begged for his family's return, is the very person who ended their lives. Shanann, who was 15 weeks pregnant with a baby boy they had hoped to name Nico, never left the house alive that day. Bella and Celeste, two innocent, bright eyed girls, met a fate no child should ever have to fear. Their remains were discovered at an oil site belonging to Chris's employer, an isolated location that he accessed early that same morning. By the end of this trial, you will understand why none of this was random or accidental. You will see that Mr. Watts faced spiraling financial pressures. He had been involved in a secret affair with a coworker named Nicole Kessinger, and that he'd grown distant from his wife, Shanann, in the weeks leading up to these murders. You will see phone records, text messages, bank statements, and suspicious internet searches that piece together a chilling narrative. A husband and a father who saw his own family as an obstacle to the new life he desperately wanted. We will begin by walking you through the key moments of August 13th. Shanann returned home around 1:48 a.m. from a business trip. That is the last confirmed moment we see her alive, captured on the doorbell camera of her entering the house. A few hours later, around 5:27 a.m., the neighbor's security camera caught Mr. Watts backing his truck into his garage, something he never normally did. You will hear from that neighbor who found it peculiar enough to record and show it to the police. Mr. Watts later insisted that it was just a routine morning, that Shanann and the girls had gone off somewhere else. But the evidence will prove otherwise. Over the next couple days, as Shanann's friends and families sounded the alarm, law enforcement discovered her body in a shallow grave at the oil site where Mr. Watts worked. Bella and Celeste, ages 3 and 4, were submerged in separate tanks of crude oil. Through forensic testimony and the photographic evidence, we will show you that no one else had the motive, the access, or the knowledge of the place where to put them. Mr. Watts alone understood the layout of that remote facility. Mr. Watts alone had the truck that arrived at precisely that location at precisely those times. People often ask why. Why would a seemingly normal father do something so horrific? Often in the world of homicide, we don't need a perfect explanation for such a terrible act, but here, the state will present evidence of an affair that Mr. Watts was trying to hide, evidence of a mounting debt and arguments over finances, and text messages where Shanann confided into close friends that Chris had grown cold and distant. You will see how he searched online for ways to begin a new life, ways to leave behind the obligations of marriage and the pressures of an expanding family. Motive is never an excuse for murder, but understanding it will help you see how we get from a man who was once a model neighbor to the killer we say he is today. This case may not feature a dramatic eye. This case may not feature dramatic eyewitnesses who saw Mr. Watts committing these murders. Instead, as in many modern investigations, the evidence comes from the footprints we leave in our daily routines. You will hear from digital forensic experts who extracted deleted texts and phone location data showing that Mr. Watts traveled to the oil site with a precise timeline matching Shanann's disappearance. You will hear from coworkers about Mr. Watts' unusual behavior at the site later that same day, his anxious demeanor, and the fact he spent more time there than usual. We will also present the medical examiner's findings. Shanann was strangled, suggesting a personal close up and deliberate method of killing. The children were smothered, a method so tragically intimate that it points to a parent or close caregiver more than any stranger. These facts, though painful to hear, are vital to understanding the level of control and calculation involved. In the days that followed, Mr. Watts gave interviews telling news outlets how he just wanted Shanann and the girls to come home. Behind the scenes, however, phone data reveals that Miss Kessinger uh, phone data reveals calls to Miss Kessinger, messages to friends that contradicted his public statements, and a lack of genuine distress consistent with a grieving husband. This facade is part of the puzzle. People capable of such act are often adept at wearing a mask of normalcy, especially under media scrutiny. We anticipate that you might hear arguments from the defense suggesting that someone else harmed Shanann or that these murders were not planned. But as the evidence unfolds, you will see that every physical and digital trace leads right back to Mr. Watts. No forced entry into the home, no signs of any suspicious individuals, and the blatant link between his own moments and the final resting place of his wife and children. Ladies and gentlemen, your duty in this trial is to examine the evidence methodically. We ask you to keep an open mind and watch as we connect each detail, from the neighbor's surveillance to the phone pings to Shanann's final text messages. We will call on more than a dozen witnesses, from law enforcement officers to forensic analysts to friends who intimately knew the Watts family. Each piece might seem small by itself: a security clip, a phone record, a coworker's observation, but woven together, they paint a singular, devastating picture. By the conclusion of this trial, the state will have proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Chris Watts intentionally ended the life of his wife Shanann and his daughters Bella and Celeste. We will show that his motive was to free himself for a new relationship and for financial relief, that he orchestrated the disposal of their bodies where only he had practical knowledge to go, and that his subsequent behavior aligned more with a killer covering his tracks than a grieving father seeking answers. The defense may urge you to find holes or missing links, but we believe you will see there is no other logical conclusion other than evidence as presented. People may lie, but phone logs and GPS coordinates do not. And when we match those cold digital facts with Mr. Watt's contradictory accounts and personal pressures, the truth becomes unmistakable. At the end of this trial, we will stand before you again and ask you for a verdict of guilty on each count of first degree murder. The evidence will leave you with no reasonable doubt as to who committed these crimes. Shanann, Bella, and Celeste cannot speak for themselves, but through this evidence, through the work of law enforcement and forensic experts, we will speak for them. We trust you to listen carefully to each witness, to weigh the facts with fairness, and ultimately to hold Mr. Watts accountable for what he has done. Thank you for your attention. So, what do you guys think? Did everyone go to sleep? Yeah, that I think is a pretty solid. Um, I think if I heard that from an attorney, I would already be thinking, um, I would already be believing what they are saying because it's such um, a powerful way that attorneys get to paint a narrative. That storytelling moment can really pull a jury, one direction or the other. So, why this style of opening matters? The emotional engagement. The prosecutors underscore the tragedy of the victims, especially the children, without relying solely on emotion. This balance impact, um, this balances impact with professionalism. Referencing the phone records and the financial data, the affair, the autopsy findings, and the prosecutor gives the jury a roadmap for what they will see in the trial. The opening transition from motive and timeline to forensic details is helping jurors understand how each piece fits together. Unfortunately, I did not include the possibility of another party member in my scenario here, um, but we haven't got to the defense's opening argument yet either. So the statement that hints that the defense might claim alternative theories, like somebody else was involved, um, implicitly preparing jurors to be skeptical of last minute suggestions and unknown perpetrators. In a real courtroom, such an opening could easily run 20 to 30 minutes um, or more. I don't know exactly how long mine was, but I can tell you it was about 1,800 words. So it's probably more than 10 minutes. Attorneys rehearse extensively, refining language to ensure clarity, emotional resonance, and persuasiveness. By the time the juries hear it, it's a culmination of meticulous preparation, years of investigation, plus weeks or months of pretrial strategy sessions, all crystallized into a single crucial narrative that will shape how jurors will perceive the evidence in the days or weeks to come. So, how does the defense prepare for an opening argument? Defense attorneys begin by surveying all the available evidence from police reports, forensic findings, financial records, witness statements, similar to the prosecutors, but they are trying to decide on a unifying theme that can undercut the prosecutor's narrative. They look for the gaps, the missing links, the chain of forensic proof, the contradictory witness accounts, or potential leads that were never fully investigated. If the prosecution's evidence is mostly circumstantial, defense attorneys often emphasize the absence of direct proof, like an eyewitness or a direct admission, placing the defendant at the crime scene. They also consider public perception. In a case In a case as high profile as the Chris Watts case, rumors and social media speculation can heavily bias potential jurors. The defense must choose whether to offer an alternative suspect theory or simply argue that the state cannot meet its burden of proof. In a family murder, this can be emotionally difficult territory, especially when children are involved. Still, defense counsel's ethical duty is to ensure that the jury does not convict without substantial conclusive evidence. When crafting an opening statement, defense attorneys aim to reframe the prosecution's story or to at least highlight the weak points. They avoid pushing far fetched scenarios unless there's no other alternative available. And they strive to keep the argument logically consistent enough that at least one juror might believe there's a reasonable doubt as to the defendant's guilt. While they may save a full alternative explanation for the evidence until they see the prosecution's witnesses in action, the opening is their first chance to tell the jury, remain open minded. There's more to this story than you think. So I've written a defense opening argument as well. Oh, I skipped a slide. So that was my slide for the prosecutor's opening statement. If you guys see that, at least you get to see it. Sorry. So for the defense's opening statement, may it please the court, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my name is Robert from Timeless Mysteries, and I'm not a real attorney, but in this hypothetical scenario, I am the defense attorney. And I have the solemn responsibility of representing Christopher Watts. You have just heard the prosecution's version of events, a narrative that I will concede sounds compelling and heartbreaking. There is no doubt that the deaths of Shanann Watts and her two young daughters, Bella and Celeste, is a tragedy of staggering proportions. My client sits here accused of committing these murder, and the state has described it as a foregone conclusion that he must be guilty. But you have not yet seen or heard the full story. Over the coming days, the prosecution will try to convince you that every aspect of this case points solely to Chris. There will they will show you surveillance clips, phone logs, and statements about an alleged affair. They will take bits and pieces of circumstantial evidence and say those bits an say those bits form an unbreakable chain of guilt. Yet no direct evidence, no eyewitnesses, no conclusive forensic proof, no indisputable video places Chris in the act of harming Shanann, Bella, or Celeste. The state's entire argument rests on interpretation, on a set of data points they claim you must see only one way. We urge you to keep an open mind because there are significant gaps and unanswered questions in the police investigation. It might shock you to learn that early on, law enforcement appeared to focus almost exclusively on Chris rather than considering the full range of possibilities. While he cooperated with authorities, speaking with them at length, he consistently denied committing any violence against his family. The prosecution wants you to interpret his calm demeanor, his decision to give interviews, and the location of his family's remains as proof of guilt. But these details on their own do not prove beyond reasonable doubt that he committed the murder. People grieve differently. They react to intense stress and scrutiny in unpredictable ways. The prosecution will try to paint my client's composure as sinister, but a quiet, flat effect can also be a shine of shock. confusion, or even ignorance about what truly happened. The state also heavily leans on the fact that Chris's workplace, an oil field, became the site of this tragedy. He has an explanation for being there. He worked there. And we will show you how the timeline and the reliability of certain digital data are not as ironclad as the state suggests. You will also hear from experts about the case and about the cause and manner of death, but you will not hear any direct forensics tying Chris's hands, DNA, or body fluids to the killings in a clear, inescapable manner. The prosecution wants you to rely on assumptions. Had he had financial stress and a mistress, so he must be guilty. That is not the standard in the court of law. In our system, the prosecution must prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Suspicion, motive, or moral failing do not automatically translate to murder. I anticipate the state may bring forward a litany of digital footprints, phone logs, location pings, text messages from Shanann to her friends. You might wonder, why didn't Chris say more or do more to find his family that day? We will address those concerns, and we will ask you to remember that confusion, fear, and even personal shame do not equal guilt of murder. Perhaps Chris had reasons he did not fully disclose, or perhaps he was terrified of being wrongly accused. The question for you is whether any of the evidence the state presents definitively proves, with any real room for doubt, that he committed 3 calculated homicides. Now, in this trial, the defense does not have to prove who else might have committed this crime. We do not have that burden. Our legal system requires that the state show you with convincing clarity that Chris is guilty. Do not let the horrific outcome overshadow the need for precise, credible proof. If an affair existed, that by itself does not demonstrate that he strangled Shanann. Many people sadly engage in affairs, yet do not murder their spouses. If the children were found at Chris's place of work, does that alone confirm he placed them there? Who else had access? And what if Chris discovered something unimaginable and panicked? The prosecution will call that theory incredible, but they must still eliminate any plausible scenario that contradicts their story. Over the course of this trial, we will pose questions. Why are certain phone records incomplete or missing? Why were certain leads not followed by law enforcement? Did the investigators ever seriously examine a timeline that might suggest someone else's involvement? But we believe the evidence you will see will reveal a rush to judgment fueled by emotion and the immediate condemnation of a husband who acted suspiciously on camera. The stakes could not be higher here. If the state fails to meet its enormous burden beyond a reasonable doubt, your duty is to return a verdict of not guilty, regardless of how tragic this entire case is. The emotional weight of losing an entire family, especially 2 little girls, cannot be minimized. But neither can we let heartbreak replace the standard of proof required in a first-degree murder trial. This is not a question of whether something horrible happened. It did. The question is, it is a question of who is truly responsible based on actual evidence, not speculation. We will ask you to examine every piece of digital forensics with a critical eye. We will ask that you remember how easily timelines can be misrepresented and how quickly assumptions can become facts in the public mind, and how seemingly obvious motives can sometimes mislead you. By the end of the trial, we will argue that the state has not proven Chris inflicted this terrible loss on his own family. We will illustrate how certain aspects of the case remain uncertain, how investigative shortcuts left room for alternate explanations, and how the prosecution's chain of inference may not be as unbreakable as they claim. We are confident that once you see the weakness in the state's case and weigh them carefully, you will conclude that a reasonable doubt exists about Chris's involvement. If there is any reasonable doubt, the law requires you to find my client not guilty. I thank you for your time, and I urge you to keep your minds open as you listen to the evidence in the days ahead. Remember, evidence, not assumption, proof, not speculation, a burden that belongs to the state, not to Chris or to the defense. Only if you're convinced beyond every reasonable doubt should you ever consider convicting this man of a crime that will end his life as we know it. Let's allow the evidence to speak for itself, and I believe you will see that it does not speak as loudly as the prosecution hopes. Thank you. So, what do you guys think of that one? So, who, just based off of the opening statements, where would you be leaning right now if you were a juror? Would you just have more questions, or would you actually be leaning towards one side or the other? Just right out the gate, right from the beginning. I think prosecutors definitely have the higher standard. They have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, and the jury doesn't have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Chris is not guilty. They just have to put doubt in the juror's mind. And we've seen it in other trials where people get acquitted that were most likely guilty. So, in a case like Chris Watts, where the forensics and circumstantial evidence is actually quite strong, the defense faces an uphill battle. Still, the argument here reflects typical real world tactics to encourage reasonable doubt. They emphasize things like no direct witnesses, possible gaps or misinterpretations of digital data. There's an over reliance on motive. Infidelity, financial stress, and unusual behavior can be suggestive, but not necessarily conclusive. And then there's the burden of proof. They reiterate the principle that the defendant does not have to prove innocence. The prosecution must remove all reasonable doubt. In practice, defense attorneys prepare by reviewing every scrap of police work to find oversight or inconsistent statements. They may hire their own forensics experts to challenge the state's findings, hoping to persuade at least one juror, because that's all they need to do is persuade one juror. Even in highly unfavorable cases, a carefully crafted opening can delay jurors' rush to judgment and maintain some level of skepticism until the prosecution evidence is fully tested through cross-examination. So, the defense's perspective of blocking and undermining evidence is also important. There's pretrial motions. The defense would likely file motions in limine. In legal context, it's a motion made to the court before a jury has been selected, typically seeking to determine the admissibility of certain evidence. They make requests to exclude evidence if it's deemed prejudicial or lacking proper foundation. If the neighbor's surveillance footage had any gaps or timestamps that are unclear, the defense could challenge its reliability. If text messages can't be definitively tied to a certain phone user, like, for example, if Chris claims someone else used his phone, They might argue that the prosecution can't prove Chris typed these words. Yeah, I think I would also I think I wrote the prosecution one better than my defense oral argument. So the cross examination is also where the defense it's basically the defense's primary weapon. Um, let's say the prosecution calls a detective to testify about GPS data. The defense might question chain of custody. How do you know the data wasn't tampered with? Did you personally handle the extraction or was it a third party? If the detective concedes any potential oversight, that could plant a seed of doubt. Consider how, in some high profile trials, even robust DNA evidence has been challenged on procedural grounds, contamination, mislabeled evidence, things like that. The defense's job is to highlight every possible flaw. Without Chris's confession, the defense might propose someone else place Shanann's body at the oil site, or that Chris was merely disposing of a body after discovering a tragic scene. However improbable it might resonate with one juror, they can't return a unanimous guilty verdict. Then, the defense doesn't need to prove an alternate scenario beyond reasonable doubt. They only need to sow enough confusion to block the prosecution's airtight story. Juries only see what the judge allows them to see. A crucial point in criminal trials is that jurors must base their decision solely on admitted evidence. They're instructed not to read news stories, social media chatter, or personal theories. If the defense successfully excludes certain damaging items, the jury never hears about them at all. For instance, if a specific text from Shanann referencing Chris's controlling behavior are deemed hearsay or insufficiently verified, that part of the story vanishes from the jury's purview. This is why pretrial rulings matter so greatly. A single evidentiary ruling can distractively alter the trial's shape beyond a reasonable doubt. Jurors receive instructions clarifying that beyond a reasonable doubt does not mean beyond all doubt. That is the moral certainty. That is a moral certainty that the accused is guilty. Prosecutors often urge jurors to use common sense. If the truck's GPS data, phone logs, and neighbors' cameras all align to show Chris left with the bodies, the simplest explanation is that Chris committed the murders. If the defense can spin a plausible alternative explanation, some jurors might hesitate. There's also persuasion versus proof. Courtroom success hinges on persuasion. The prosecution must take complex data like cell phone tower records and explain them in plain language. A good prosecutor might illustrate at 5:30 a.m. Uh, his phone pinged here near the oil tanks, exactly where Shanann was found. The defense attorney counters with, he's an oil worker. Of course, his phone pinged near the oil tanks. That doesn't prove he killed anyone. And the jury weighs which argument feels more credible. The emotional underpinnings. It's easy to forget that jurors are human. Real trials can span weeks, leaving jurors tired, emotionally taxed, sometimes frustrated. They see photos of victims and hear about family life and read text messages. In Family Annihilator case, the details are especially grim. There's a pregnant mother, there's two small children. That emotional weight can influence a jury's willingness to accept the prosecutor's narrative. At the same time, the defense might remind them, do not let emotion override the facts. You must keep your verdict grounded in evidence, not in sympathy. All told, if Chris never confessed, these strategies, from pretrial motions to the final summation, would dictate the trial's flow. The prosecution would present a carefully curated story, bridging every piece of evidence into a singular conclusion. Chris alone is responsible. The defense would fight tooth and nail to exclude and undermine that narrative, seeking to carve out enough room for reasonable doubt. In modern American courts, that's the intellectual battlefield upon which guilt or innocent is decided. So let's talk a little bit about how jurors, the jury dynamics, the group deliberation. After closing arguments, the 12 jurors, or sometimes fewer, retreat to a deliberation room. They're dramatically, but group dynamics often take on a life of their own. Strong personalities can sway more passive jurors. Emotional responses can overshadow facts, even though instructions warn against it. In many homicide trials, a defendant's confession looms large. Without it, some jurors might question whether the suspect really truly did it, especially if they're predisposed to believe a nice, quiet person couldn't be guilty of such brutality. On the other hand, certain jurors might interpret Chris's missing confession as a manipulative refusal to take responsibility, leading them to question his moral character. The benefit of the doubt. Some individuals are intrinsically skeptical of the government's case. They worry about wrongful convictions. If the defense effectively highlights small inconsistencies or leaps in the prosecutor's timeline, it can resonate with a juror who's determined to avoid convicting an innocent man. In a no confession scenario, these concerns are amplified. Then there's direct versus circumstantial evidence. Direct evidence includes eyewitness accounts. And I actually heard this really cool thing the other day. I didn't write it in here, but the difference between direct evidence and circumstantial evidence would be like if you stuck your hand outside the window and you could feel snowflakes falling from the sky. Then you go to bed and you wake up and there's snow on the ground. You can consider that as direct um, evidence that it snowed last night. Whereas if you just go to bed and you wake up the next morning and there's snow on the ground, you can determine that it snowed last night still, but it's circumstantial evidence because you didn't witness it directly. Um, direct evidence includes eyewitnesses' accounts, video capturing the crime in progress. Circumstantial evidence requires jurors to infer guilt based on a chain of facts, like GPS logs placing Chris at the oil site, combined with Shanann's disappearance, combined with Chris's affair. While direct evidence is rare in domestic homicides because it happens behind closed door, circumstantial evidence in these kinds of cases is very strong, and they are equally just as potent as direct evidence. Prosecutors repeatedly remind jurors that they are convicted every day based on circumstantial evidence, exhibits, charts. In a complicated case, prosecutors often use visual aids, timelines, maps of the area, text message compilations. Jurors are more likely to be convinced by a cohesive narrative that they can see rather than just hear. Let's see. I also forgot to change the slide. I did take the time to make these because I thought it was kind of interesting, but I don't know how to work my PowerPoint into this yet. So for instance, it's a complicated case. Prosecutors are using visual aids. And for instance, the prosecution might show a map of Frederick, Colorado, highlight a route from the Watts home to the oil site, superimpose timestamps from the neighbor's videos plus phone records. This visual can clarify any confusion and reinforce the connection between Chris's movements and the time his family vanished. While motive is not strictly necessary to prove murder, it's powerful in swaying a jury. If the prosecution can paint Chris as a man cornered by debt, longing for a fresh start with a new partner, the jury may find it easier to see him capable of annihilating his entire family to free himself. Motive appeals to common sense. Why else would he do it? They also underscore that the location of the bodies, Chris, it was his own workplace. It wasn't some random place. The defense countermeasures, like I said before, their sole purpose is to undermine the prosecutor's story arc. Defense attorneys tackle each puzzle piece in the state's mosaic, aiming to disrupt the overreaching narrative. They might concede certain facts while fiercely challenging others. Sure, Chris was having an affair, but that doesn't equate to homicide. He took the bodies to the oil field um, only after discovering Shanann had hurt the children. Contradictory as it sounds, they only need to plant some version of the story um, that an uncertain juror might cling to. Often, murder suspects who don't testify are shielded from cross examination. The defense may decide that Chris's soft spoken, unemotional presentation will do more harm than good on the stand. They might reason that it's better for the jury to have limited exposure to him, preventing any potential slip or unconvincing explanation. If the defendant does choose to testify, the cross examination can be brutal, with the prosecution leveraging every contradictory statement that was ever made. The defense repeatedly reminds the jurors that the prosecutor's job is to dispel any rational doubt. They can say, is it not possible that someone else forced Chris Watts to dispose of the body? Is it not possible that Shanann left the house alive? Even if these scenarios sound far fetched, they only need to resonate with one or two jurors who believe the burden of proof hasn't been met. A well known example would be the Scott Peterson case. He was convicted of killing his wife, Lacey, and their unborn son. He never confessed. The state built a circumstantial case involving an affair, suspicious behavior, and the location where Lacey's remains were found. Peterson's defense argued that the evidence was all circumstantial and open to interpretation. But the jury still found him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, largely due to the strong mosaic of motive plus location based evidence. Another case would be Casey Anthony, um, which also had no confession. Prosecutors had intense circumstantial evidence that Casey murdered her daughter, Kaylee, yet the jury acquitted her. Why? Some believe the prosecution oversold a motive and underdelivered on direct forensic proof. The defense poked through the holes, suggesting alternative theories, and the jury felt they lacked that final clinching piece of evidence tying Casey directly to the murder. These examples illuminate that even a seemingly strong circumstantial case can end in an acquittal if the jury believes there's a plausible alternative explanation. Would that have happened with Chris Watts? While there's no two cases that are identical, the disposal site being Chris's own workplace stands out as a particularly incriminating fact, a level of incrimination perhaps missing in the Casey scenario. For instance, nonetheless, the defense might have tried everything from false accusations against Shanann to claims of an unknown intruder. If the prosecution's narrative clicks for the jury, demonstrating motive, placing Chris at the crime scene, discrediting any alternative scenarios, they return ununanimous verdict of first degree murder. Chris faces life in prison or possibly death. Um, a jury could theoretically convict him of a lesser offense, such as second degree murder, if they believe he killed Shanann in a sudden rage but didn't plan it. However, the evidence of disposing the bodies and the children's death typically point to a premeditated mindset. So, second degree murder might be less likely, but not impossible. An acquittal or a hung jury, even if one juror balks, you could get a hung jury, forcing a mistrial and potential retrial. Or if a majority genuinely believes that the defense's arguments have cast too many doubts, Chris could walk free. This scenario is least likely given the strength of the forensic and digital evidence, but it's not inconceivable. In short, real jury dynamics incorporate reason, emotion, personal bias, and the persuasiveness of each legal team. In a case as public and tragic as the Watts murders, the weight of the evidence, the GPS, the phone logs, the motive, would likely prove formidable. But as every legal scholar knows, a trial's outcome isn't guaranteed until the jury announces its verdict. So, after our look at the evidence and this possible trial, um, could Chris Watts have gotten away with murder if he never confessed? The simplest answer, based on the totality of the circumstances, is that it was highly unlikely that he evaded conviction in the long run. We can go back over the facts, the GPS data, his workplace. This is alone is probably the most damning piece of evidence. Um, the bodies were found on the property where Chris was that morning. Uh, he's documented going there early that morning, aligning with the last known time Shanann and the children were alive. This direct location based proof is something defenses typically struggle to surmount unless they can generate a wholly different perpetrator scenario. The text from Shanann, the Google searches, her phone logs, the conversations she had with her friends about Chris, those are also, very um, hard for a defense team to counter. They would argue, defense attorneys would argue the possibility of an unknown killer, maybe, or an act of violence by Shanann, but the practical difficulties of explaining away the oil-filled burial site combined with the textual evidence of a marriage and marital discord weigh heavily against them. If um, if only one juror can say we can't be sure, It's another convincingly it in front of a jury. It's one thing to say we can't be sure. It's another thing to convincingly demonstrate rational alternate alternatives that fit the timeline and the evidence. So there is a slim chance of reasonable doubt. In extreme cases, a jury can disregard the evidence for personal reasons, but that's rare and typically cuts in favor for a sympathetic defendant, which Chris was not. There, if the police botched evidence collection or a key piece of forensic data was disallowed at trial, the defense could exploit that. A single reasonable doubt about the timeline or the cause of death might unravel the prosecutor's case if it hits the right chord. We see from the Casey Anthony verdict that the jury sometimes demands a smoking gun. If a perceived forensic evidence as inconclusive, if they perceive a forensic evidence, um, if they perceive forensic evidence as inconclusive or purely circumstantial, they may acquit. That said, the discovery of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste at Chris's workplace is a much stronger direct link than anything found in the Casey Anthony scenario. So the outcome would likely be guilty of first degree murder on all counts. The evidence suggests premeditation. Chris had the children's body hidden in separate oil tanks, presumably to stifle discovery and hamper forensic testing. This evidence, this level of concealment typically indicates planning. Potential sentences. Colorado at the time allowed for the death penalty, though it's rarely carried out. Alternatively, multiple life sentences without parole would still be on the table. Without a plea deal removing capital punishment, Chris risked a truly severe sentence. So, even if the suspect denies everything, today's investigative methods, digital forensics, phone geolocations, and advanced DNA analysis make it hard to truly get away with murder. Decades ago, a killer might have hidden behind an alibi or lied about their whereabouts, but now our phones, security cameras, and social media footprints betray us at every turn. In the Watts case specifically, the sheer weight of contradictory evidence was overwhelming. Family annihilations cases rarely end with the perpetrator escaping justice, especially when a direct link, like a private work site, are used for body disposal. Psychological profile of a man desperate to erase his old life for a new one ties neatly into the array of circumstantial facts. Absent Chris's own words, the state would have hammered home each damning detail until the jury saw the bigger picture. Chris Watts's confession shortened the legal drama. He accepted responsibility, though only after lying multiple times and initially blaming Shanann for the children's death. In the real timeline, his plea avoided a trial, provided some closure, but it's minimal for Shanann's family, and spared them from weeks of horrifying evidence in court. But had he remained silent, we would likely have seen a saga reminiscent of other high profile murder trials with daily updates on the most minute to minute details, developments. Would the final verdict differ? In all probability, it wouldn't have. The confession simply accelerated the outcome. Modern juries can and do convict based solely on circumstantial evidence when it fits a coherent narrative that defies any other plausible explanation. So, answering our question, could could Chris Watts have gotten away with murder if he never confessed? Almost certainly not. Between the digital footprints, the suspicious behavior, Shanann's documented worries, and there's camera footage, the eventual discovery of the bodies at the work site, the route to a not guilty verdict would have been extraordinarily narrow. A cunning attorney could try to poke holes, but the jury would confront a mountain of interconnected clues. It's the synergy of these clues rather than any single detail, like a smoking gun, that would have sealed his fate. In the end, um, that's the power of modern investigation and prosecutor prosec, prosecutorial strategy. So he did it. So I guess that's kind of all I have for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Um, I know it was kind of a long one, but yeah, I spent a lot of time working on it, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. So does anyone here think that Chris Watts could have been found not guilty? Thank you, Lauren. I hope it was better than my last one. I did plan that one out too, but it didn't quite work. Uh, well, guys, go ahead and smash that little heart button a few times, and I'm going to go ahead and go off record here. Oh, thank you, Lauren, for the the little donation. Thank you. I think that's the first one I've ever gotten. With Casey Anthony, I'm pretty sure all it was there was not enough evidence. They actually thought she was guilty, but they didn't think the evidence proved it. And so they were forced to acquit her. But I don't know why they didn't try to, you know, charge second degree murder or something else, because there's a lot of evidence that that she did it or knew about it or something. Because I think the weirdest piece of evidence from that case was the fact that she went out partying for a month after the daughter disappeared. Who would do that? Yeah, but I don't think they can charge her with murder. I don't know. Can they charge her with second degree murder now after she's been acquitted? Double jeopardy kind of prevents them from retrying her, but they should have got her for something else. I saw her on TikTok a couple of weeks ago. She's some kind of legal aid, and she's starting her TikTok page. And probably got a lot of followers. Kind of makes me a little disturbed that people can get away with stuff like that and then just go about their lives like nothing happened. I think if there was a trial, she would have been thoroughly investigated, and then we can know once and for all whether or not she knew about it or not. Because I'm not sure. I go back and forth. Like, it seems logical, and then it doesn't. Also, um, the part that keeps me from like being completely sure that Nicole Kessinger did this was part of it or knew about it, at least in some way, was the fact that they'd only been supposedly dating for like 6 weeks. That's not enough time to, gain feelings strong enough to help somebody with a murder, I think. I don't think it's likely that that would be would be even possible. So I don't think she was a part of it, but I think she knew about it. Or, maybe Chris said some things that kind of suggested it and she didn't do anything about it. Yeah. Gypsy Rose is another interesting story. That girl had a horrible life, and I get it. But she was trained by her mother to gain sympathy every time she speaks, and she's gaining sympathy now the same way she was before. Only this time it's different because she's not in a wheelchair, you know. Um, I don't know. I really feel bad for the boy that she convinced to do the actual stabbing. Like, it was really shocking to me that she didn't get, life in prison. And when she got out of prison, I was like, well, maybe she's changed. And I started like falling for that like, I don't know how she does it. She just like gets people sympathetic for her somehow. And I started noticing that, oh, I was starting to sympathize with her. And then I remembered what she did when she was a kid. She got a house donated to them for her mother and her. You know, that's based off of the sympathy thing that she's got. She's very persuasive in that regard. Yeah, that's insane. Well, guys, I'm gonna get off of here because I've been talking for it looks like an hour and a half. Um, but I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you guys got questions, go back and watch the video and then leave comments. Also, share this with your friends if they like this kind of information. I know it's not completely like factual based, but it is a pretty good. I think it's good fiction. It's plausible and kind of helps us look at this case differently, I think. So, um, you guys are welcome. I'm going to try to have another live stream next weekend, but I got to record a couple videos for my long form stuff. Oh, you know what? I could show you guys something that I haven't published yet. It's going to come out next weekend. Let me see if I can find it. Just give me a second. It's going to take a minute here. But I've got a pretty cool Ed Gein story coming out. It's still I'm still working on it at the moment, but it's basically almost done. And I just gotta find it. I thought I saved it. Okay, I found it. So let me see if I can share. Okay. This should work. I'm just going to show you the opening. Oh, there's no sound. 1957. A ferocious thunderstorm rolls across the Wisconsin countryside. Sheets of rain lash out at an old farmhouse crouched in an overgrown field outside of Plainfield. Lightning claws through the sky, illuminating for a split second the sagging roof and the peeling paint of the Gein house. In that brief flash, the yard's neglect is laid bare. Weeds swallow the crumbling fence posts, and the skeletal outline of a collapsed barn leans in ruin nearby. Littered with rusted farm tools left where they were long ago abandoned, the heavy air presses down with the scent of wet earth and decay. Each crack of thunder rattles loose the window panes and make the dilapidated walls tremble. It's as if the house itself shudders at the secrets it holds. Inside, darkness reigns, but for the dim glow of a kerosene lamp. The farmhouse has no electricity, only wavering amber light that dances over stained wallpaper and warped floorboards. The wallpaper, once a cheerful floral print, hangs in curling shreds from the walls, spotted with mildew from years of leaks and neglect. Dust motes swirl in the damp, heavy air. Piles of old newspapers and broken farm tools clutter the corners alongside the cracked porcelain dolls and moldering books. Everything is coated in a thick, slimy grime. Well, I just thought I would share some of that. It's not quite done yet, but it's more descriptive, kind of like a story, but it's based on the true life of Ed Gein. Um, the only thing that's not true is the kind of descriptive stuff I use, but it's also the first long form video that I've ever done that I put my face on. So it might be a new normal. I don't know. But anyways, guys, I'm glad you guys were all here. I had a lot of fun, and you guys have a good day. Stay kind, be vigilant, and I'll catch you in the next video.